There is a particular kind of stillness in certain people. Not calm, not peace, something closer to a wall that has learned to look like a person. I have noticed this in people I have known for years, the ones who order the same meal every single time, who take the same route home even when it is slower, who can tell you exactly what is wrong with a new idea before they have even finished hearing it. You probably know someone exactly like this. Maybe a parent, a coworker, a partner. Maybe, if you are honest with yourself for a moment, you know this feeling from the inside too. What is strange is that these people are not unhappy with their lives, not exactly. They are not in crisis. They simply seem to have made a quiet, permanent decision that the world they already understand is the only world worth living in. And the moment something threatens to rearrange that world, even slightly, something in them goes rigid. I want to show you something about what is actually happening underneath that rigidity, because it is not stubbornness in the way most people assume. There is a man, and I will call him he for now, because in some way he is not just one person. He is a composite of a generation, mostly men who grew up believing that stability was the highest form of success. He built a life, a routine, a way of doing things, and somewhere along the way that structure stopped being a tool he used and became something closer to his identity. When his company suggests new software, he does not see a tool. He sees an accusation that the way he has worked for 20 years was wrong. When his children suggest he try something new, a different way of eating, a different way of talking about feelings, he does not hear advice. He hears an indictment of the life he has already lived. This is the part most people miss. Resistance to change is rarely about the change itself. It is about what the change implies regarding the past. Psychologists describe this through the lens of identity protection. Once a person builds enough of their self-concept around a particular way of living, any new information that contradicts that way of living becomes, in a very real neurological sense, a threat to the self. Not a threat to comfort, a threat to identity. This is why he does not simply disagree with the new idea. He defends against it, the way the body defends against an infection. You may have felt a milder version of this yourself. The flash of irritation when someone questions a belief you have held for a long time, even when, somewhere quiet inside you, you suspect they might have a point. What makes this pattern so difficult to see from the inside is that it never announces itself as fear. It dresses itself up as logic, as wisdom, as "I just know what works." And once you understand that, the rest of the picture starts to come into focus, because there are specific ways this shows up, signs that build on each other, starting with the ones we can see easily and ending with the ones almost no one notices in themselves. There are 6 of them, and they follow a particular order. The first ones are behaviors you could spot in someone from across a room. The last ones live much deeper, in the quiet architecture of how a person relates to their own life. Let's start with the one that is the easiest to see and the hardest to admit. The first sign is what I would call defensive certainty. This is the immediate, almost reflexive insistence that the current way is the only correct way, delivered with a confidence that has nothing to do with actual evidence. He does this constantly. Someone proposes a new process at work, and before they have even finished the sentence, he's already explaining why it will not work, why it has been tried before, why people who suggest these things do not understand how things really function. Notice that he is not evaluating the idea, he is defending against it.
He is rejecting it on principle, and principle in this case is just a polite word for fear wearing a suit. The psychological mechanism here is straightforward. Certainty feels safer than evaluation. Evaluation requires sitting with uncertainty, weighing pros and cons, admitting you might be wrong. Certainty skips all of that. It gives an immediate, comfortable answer, even if that answer is not actually true. You may recognize this in yourself in smaller ways. The instant no that arrives before you have even considered the request. That speed is the tell. Genuine thinking takes a moment. Defense is instant. In daily life across the US or the UK, you see this in workplaces where someone insists on using an outdated system because it works fine, even as colleagues quietly lose hours to its inefficiency. The system is not actually fine, but admitting that would mean admitting that years of effort were spent defending something flawed, and that is a harder thing to swallow than a little extra work. Once defensive certainty is in place, something else starts happening underneath it, something a bit less visible but closely connected. The second sign is selective memory, and this one is sneakier because it disguises itself as nostalgia rather than fear. He talks about the past in a particular way, always slightly better than it actually was. The old job was simpler. The old neighborhood was friendlier. The old way of raising children produced stronger people. None of these statements are entirely false, but they are not entirely true either. They are edited. The difficult parts, the loneliness, the limited opportunities, the things that were genuinely worse, get quietly trimmed out of the story. This happens because the mind is not just remembering the past, it is using the past to justify staying where it currently is. If the past was good, then resisting change to preserve it feels noble rather than fearful. Selective memory turns resistance into loyalty. You may notice this when older relatives describe their younger years with a glow that never quite matches the photographs or the records. It is not dishonesty, it is the mind protecting a worldview by curating the evidence that supports it. In countries like the US, this often surfaces in conversations about technology, where someone insists that life was better before smartphones, while conveniently forgetting the isolation, the slower access to medical information, the difficulty of staying in touch with family who moved far away. This selective editing of the past quietly sets the stage for something even more revealing, because if the past has to be protected this carefully, it suggests something about how fragile the present identity actually feels. The third sign is what I would describe as control through ritual, the tendency to over-rely on routine, not because the routine is efficient, but because it is predictable. He has the same breakfast every day, takes the same path to the same store, sits in the same seat at every family gathering. These are not preferences, they are anchors. When the rest of life feels uncertain, when health changes, when relationships shift, when the future stops feeling guaranteed, ritual becomes a way of proving, at least in this one corner of existence, that he still has control. This is a documented psychological pattern. Under conditions of uncertainty or anxiety, people increase reliance on routine because predictability reduces the physiological stress response. The ritual is not really about the breakfast.
It is about regulating a nervous system that does not feel safe with the unknown. You may have felt this yourself during a stressful period, suddenly needing your coffee made exactly the same way every single morning. Not because it tasted different, but because that small predictability felt like the only stable thing in a day full of unstable things. In households across Europe and North America, this often appears as an intense, almost disproportionate reaction to small disruptions. Someone rearranging the furniture, a different brand of coffee in the cupboard, a holiday tradition altered even slightly. The reaction seems oversized for the event. That is because the event is not really the problem. The loss of predictability is. Once routine becomes the main source of psychological safety, the next sign follows almost automatically, because anything that threatens the routine starts to feel like a personal attack rather than a neutral event. The fourth sign is personalization of neutral events, where ordinary changes get experienced as deliberate insults or signs of disrespect. He does not just dislike that his daughter wants to do the holidays differently this year. He feels betrayed by it, as though her preference is a judgment on every holiday that came before. He does not simply notice that a new manager wants different reporting methods. He feels disrespected, as though the new method is a statement that his old method was inadequate. This happens because somewhere along the way, his sense of self became entangled with his methods. When the method is challenged, the self feels challenged. There is no longer a difference in his mind between "this process changed" and "I am being criticized."
You might notice a version of this in yourself when someone offers feedback on something you made or did, and despite knowing intellectually that the feedback is about the work, it still lands somewhere closer to the chest, somewhere that feels much more personal than it logically should. In workplace cultures across the US, you see this when long-tenured employees interpret organizational restructuring as a personal referendum on their value, even when the changes have nothing to do with their individual performance. The mind fills in a narrative of rejection where none was actually intended. This personalization deepens into something even more concerning, because once every change feels like an attack, the natural next step is to start avoiding situations where change might occur at all. The fifth sign is preemptive avoidance, the quiet narrowing of life to eliminate any possibility of having to adapt. He stops trying new restaurants. He avoids unfamiliar cities. He turns down invitations to events with people he does not already know well. None of this looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like simple preference, like someone who just knows what they like. But underneath it is something closer to a shrinking perimeter, a life being carefully managed to avoid ever having to encounter the unfamiliar. This is one of the clearest markers of underlying anxiety about change, because it is proactive rather than reactive. He is not just resisting change when it appears, he is restructuring his entire life so that it appears as rarely as possible. You may have felt the early version of this yourself, the small instinct to decline a new opportunity not because it lacks appeal, but because the unfamiliarity itself feels exhausting before you have even tried it. In Western countries, this often shows up subtly in social patterns, men in particular narrowing their friendships down to the same handful of people for decades, not because deeper connection was found there, but because new relationships require the unpredictable work of getting to know someone, and that unpredictability has quietly become intolerable. The narrowing of the external world eventually points towards something happening internally as well, something that is harder to observe because it is not really a behavior at all. It is closer to a belief system. The sixth sign, and the deepest one, is what I would call identity fusion with the past self, the point where a person no longer experiences themselves as someone who is still developing, but as someone who is already finished. This is different from the other 5 signs. The first 5 are behaviors you can watch.
This one is a quiet internal conclusion. This is who I am, and who I am is no longer up for discussion. He stops asking what he wants to become. He only defends what he has already become. Growth starts to feel less like an opportunity and more like an accusation that the current version of him is somehow insufficient. Psychologically, this often correlates with what researchers describe as a fixed rather than a growth-oriented self-concept. When identity is treated as a finished product rather than an ongoing process, any invitation to change becomes, by definition, a threat to that finished product. There is no version of growth that does not first require admitting, "I am not yet complete," and for someone who has fused entirely with the idea of being complete, that admission feels unbearable. You may recognize this in the way certain people respond to therapy, to feedback, even to gentle suggestions from people who love them, not with curiosity, but with something closer to grief, as though being asked to grow is the same as being told their whole life so far was a mistake.
And this is the piece that finally explains everything we have walked through. The certainty, the selective memory, the rituals, the personalization, the avoidance, all of it is protecting this one core belief, that who he is right now is who he is supposed to remain. When you put these 6 signs together, defensive certainty, selective memory, control through ritual, personalization of neutral events, preemptive avoidance, and identity fusion with the past self, you are no longer looking at 6 separate quirks. You are looking at one coherent psychological structure. A person who built an entire internal world around the idea that stability equals safety, and who experiences any disruption to that world as a disruption to the self. I think this is worth sitting with for a moment, not because it is a flattering picture, but because most of us carry a smaller, quieter version of it somewhere. Maybe not as extreme as the man we have been describing, but maybe in one relationship, one belief, one corner of your life where you have decided, without ever quite saying it out loud, that this is simply how things are and how they will stay. You might think about the people in your life who resist change the most and ask yourself honestly what they might be protecting underneath that resistance. It is rarely the surface issue. It is rarely really about the schedule or the software or the holiday plans. It is almost always about something further down, some quiet fear that changing the method means admitting the self was not as solid as it seemed. And you might also ask, more uncomfortably, where you do this yourself. Not in some dramatic way, but in the small refusals, the instant no before consideration, the slight irritation when something familiar gets rearranged. These moments are not character flaws. They are simply the places where your own sense of self has quietly attached itself to something external. Recognizing them is not an indictment. It's closer to a map. There's one more layer to this conversation worth exploring eventually, which is what actually allows some people to loosen this grip, to remain stable in who they are while still being open to becoming someone slightly different. That distinction between identity and habit turns out to matter more than almost anything else in how a person experiences the rest of their life. If this video helped you see something you had not quite named before, I think you would get a lot out of the next one, where we go further into, because it picks up exactly where this leaves off. Thank you for staying with me through this one. If something in here resonated with you, I would genuinely like to know. Was there a sign here that reminded you of someone close to you, or maybe of yourself? Leave a comment and tell me which one landed the hardest. If this kind of exploration is useful to you, consider subscribing. There's a lot more of this kind of thinking ahead, and I would love to keep exploring it together.